everyone, welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis is decolonization, causes and impacts. In this lecture, we shall attempt to understand meaning of the concept of decolonization. This lecture shall also explain various causes responsible for decolonization, and we shall attempt to understand this topic through a comparative perspective. In this lecture, we shall also discuss the various debates, arguments, outcome through the analysis of the concept of decolonization with several examples. This lecture shall be of great use for the learners from the discipline of political science, international relations, subjects of comparative political analysis, and learners keen on world contemporary history. As we begin the lecture, we all know that between 1945 and 1960, any account of modern world history tells us that there were many states in Asia and Africa who attained their independence from colonial rulers. This gets us to the important question: what do we mean by decolonization? Decolonization, it is the process by which the colonies became independent of the colonizing country. In the similar perspective, decolonization can be understood, that is, it's a process of withdrawal from its former colonies by the colonial power. As we are discussing decolonization, we need to also understand the meaning of the term colonialism. Now, when we understand the concept of colonialism, the popular search through internet explains to us, quoting the definition from merriam-webster.com, that colonialism, it is the process of domination of a people or area by a foreign state or nation. The goal of the colonizing power, the colonizing country, is to get profit by exploiting the human and the economic resources of the countries they colonized. There are various types of colonialism. When we debate on the typology of colonialism, from settler colonialism, exploitation colonialism, surrogate colonialism, internal colonialism are some important types while we understand and debate the topic of colonialism. Colonialism is often used together with the concept of imperialism. What do we mean by imperialism? Imperialism, it is the state policy, practice or advocacy of extending power and dominion. Now, there are various types of imperialism: colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence are certain important types of imperialism. So therein lies the difference between colonialism and imperialism. Colonialism is where one nation assumes control over the other, whereas imperialism, it is the political or the economic control. Now, as we understand the concept of decolonization, herein we must understand that there is no one format or no one unilinear perspective. Because in some states, decolonization was peaceful, whereas in other states, decolonization was the result of the revolution. An important example here, Algeria, Kenya. Both the countries used guerrilla warfare to reclaim their independence. Further, as we are to understand decolonization, we must take into account that decolonization happened in the aftermath of the Second World War. Now, in the Second World War, as we understand the Second World War, which was a very important event in the world history, we must understand that the backdrop of Second World War, the failure of the League of Nations, the formation of the Axis coalition, German aggression, worldwide depression, Treaty of Versailles after the First World War, paving way for the Second World War. Now, with all of it, the outcome of the Second World War, in a manner, impacted the colonial powers. We all know that the colonial powers were weakened after the Second World War. Now, this weakening of the colonial powers after the Second World War presented an opportunity for several countries in many regions and other regions to increase, to amplify their struggle for independence. Further, we must understand that because of the Second World War, where all the European countries were involved, later, after the Second World War, the European countries, they lacked the wealth and the political support which was needed to suppress the far away revolts. Further, as we understand the process of decolonization along with the aftermath of the Second World War, one must also the changes in the global reality because of the start of the Cold War. The Cold War was not an actual war but an ideological conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Cold War, as an ideological conflict between the United States on one hand and the Soviet Union on the other hand, somewhere worked in a manner that European powers were then involved in the process of rebuilding their state polity and economy, and United States had become powerful. So in this context, the colonies that were fighting for their independence, it worked to their advantage. Similarly, at the end of the Second World War, the world witnesses the emergence of United Nations. United Nations was established after the Second World War. The United Nations as an international organization succeeded the League of Nations. 4 months after the San Francisco Conference ended, the United Nations officially began on 24th October 1945 when it came into existence. Further, with the establishment of United Nations, in order to see its impact on decolonization, one has to understand the aims for which the United Nations was established, namely to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations amongst nations on the basis of equality and the principle of self-determination, to foster worldwide cooperation in solving economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian problems. Now, this very idea of nurturing friendly relations amongst nations on the basis of equality and the principle of self-determination indeed worked to the advantage of several Afro-Asian and Latin American countries who were already struggling for independence, and thereby the establishment of United Nations after the Second World War worked to the advantage to increase the process of decolonization. Therefore, with the end of the Second World War, the start of the Cold War, establishment of United Nations, somewhere there was change in the focus of international relations. The new focus on anti-colonialism in international arena also worked to ensure that process of decolonization was successful. Further, as we are looking at decolonization, one must also understand the internal dynamics of respective nation states. Now, looking at comparative perspective, Africa presents a different example, wherein in some areas decolonization was due to failing of local economies due to exploitation of resources and cheap labor by the colonial power. Now, with the failing of local economies, it was then not viable as well as profitable for the colonial powers to maintain their colonial rule in African countries. The economics of European powers then became costly for the region. To substantiate more on this economic aspect relating to decolonization, let us take reference of an important example. Well-known French journalist Raymond Cartier used this economic argument to describe and illustrate the French withdrawal from sub-Saharan Africa. That is, when we understand that what made the French withdrew itself from the sub-Saharan Africa, namely because it became economically unviable to be there in the region. Another perspective, as we understand decolonization through a comparative lens, that is, colonial powers in most cases pursued a transfer of power over state institutions to local interlocutors relying on negotiation. Important examples here are of Vietnam and Algeria. As we understand decolonization, we must understand that colonization as a process worked in a manner which signified European rivalry. Colonialism became to be used synonymously with nationalism. Colonies became an important symbol of national prestige. The idea of Pax Britannica is indeed very significant here to deliberate. So, as we are discussing decolonization, the role of Harold Macmillan, British Prime Minister, who helped to begin decolonization, must also be understood. Harold Macmillan, British Prime Minister, he speeded up the process of decolonization, reoriented British foreign policy, and the most important, Winds of Change speech in 1960. The Wind of Change speech was made in February 1960 by the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan while addressing the South African Parliament in Cape Town. To quote from the speech, that is, the wind of change is blowing through this continent. And whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. We must all accept it as a fact, and our national policies must take account of it. So herein the speech, the most important speech, Wind of Change speech by the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, clearly tells the important aspect that there was a national consciousness with respect to ushering in change. Somewhere worked to ensure and speed up the process of decolonization. As we understand decolonization, there are further varied interpretations, that is, namely, when did it start? Some historians, comparative political analysts, studies in world history situated to India achieving independence in 1947, while others talk about end of British rule in Kenya in 1963, independence of Portuguese colonies in 1974. So we see that over a series of time from 1947 to 1963 to 1974, somewhere the process of decolonization did not stop, and it sustained and evolved over a period of time and decade. As we talk about decolonization, it is very essential to understand the typology, to understand it from a comparative perspective. Let's understand decolonization through a comparative lens. Now, there are various types of decolonization. First, self-government for white settler colonies. Historians, anthropologists often give the example of Canada and Australia in this regard. Second, formal end to empire followed by independent rule. Third, formal empire replaced by informal empire or neo-colonialism, as several political economists point out. Fourth, mere change of imperial power. So therefore, what we see that decolonization as a process, it did work in a manner after the Second World War, with the start of Cold War, establishment of UN, several Afro-Asian countries becoming independent. Now, with this independence, decolonization also had an important impact on the newly independent countries. We all know that after the Second World War, the European powers were weakened. Now, what was the impact of decolonization on the newly independent countries? In some areas, there was instability of the post-colonial political systems, whereas in other areas, there were economic problems as the domestic realms. Further, there was north-south divide when we look at the global realms. Because of exploitation of resources, the countries in the north remained rich, whereas countries in the south remained poor. So, while understanding impact of decolonization, there is no unilinear perspective. In some areas, decolonization was responsible for instability of the political system, whereas in other areas there were economic problems, and one also has to factor in decolonization with the important impact on international relations, namely the issue of rich north versus poor south, the issue concerning north-south divide. Further, a few newly independent countries, they acquired stable governments almost immediately, whereas others were ruled by dictators, military juntas for decades, or they endured long civil war. Some European countries welcomed a new relationship with the former colonies, whereas others contested decolonization militarily. So here and once again in respect of the outcome also, in some areas where stability came forward, other areas it was not there at the political system apparatus. Some colonial powers went for and welcomed new relationship with the former colonies, wherein others contested decolonization militarily. Decolonization also changed the pattern of international relations, and herein we must understand that how decolonization altered the composition of United Nations. Decolonization also presented new political complexity in various regions of the globe, wherein with rise of new territories, independent states, geography and natural resources, availability of resources therein came to play an important role while deciding the power dynamics of the global governance. So one sees that decolonization as an important process in the world history, especially between 1945 to 1960s. Several Afro-Asian Latin American countries achieved independence from their European colonial rulers, and decolonization, the process by which colonies became independent of the colonizing country, was not just limited to countries becoming independent, because it had important ramifications at political, economic, global governance, cultural realms, dynamics of both the colonial power as well as the colony. Dear learners, we hope that the lecture presented to you significant inputs for understanding the causes and impacts of decolonization. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.